The storm had been battering Milbrook Falls for hours, turning the quiet Oregon streets into rivers of regret. Carter Wells gripped his steering wheel tighter, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the relentless downpour as he navigated home from another, crushing double shift at Morrison's garage. At 35, exhaustion had become his closest companion. But tonight something else waited in the darkness ahead. His headlights swept across the empty road and froze. A figure crumpled on the asphalt. A young woman in a pale blue dress, her dark hair plastered against porcelain skin, crimson spreading beneath her like spilled wine. Carter's heart hammered against his ribs as he knelt beside her trembling form. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with pain. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain drumming on pavement. "Don't lift my skirt." Blood poured steadily from a deep gash in her thigh, painting the wet ground in urgent red streams. Time compressed into heartbeats. Carter's hands hovered over the fabric that stood between her modesty and her life. Carter had spent 3 years learning that life rarely offered clean choices. He thought of Rosie sleeping peacefully in their small apartment, waiting for Daddy to come home with another bedtime story about fixing broken things. But some things couldn't wait for permission. The woman's breathing grew shallow, her skin taking on the pallor of approaching death. Carter made his choice. Gently, respectfully, he lifted the hem of her dress just enough to reach the wound. His work-calloused fingers pressed against the torn flesh, applying pressure with the same careful precision he used on delicate engine parts. She whimpered but didn't fight him. As he worked, Carter caught a glimpse of something unexpected on her inner thigh. A small, intricate tattoo. Numbers. They looked like coordinates, but before he could process their meaning, the woman's eyes rolled back. He scooped her into his arms, a slight frame feeling fragile as autumn leaves, and ran toward his truck. The emergency room at Milbrook General buzzed with late-night chaos, but the arrival of an unconscious woman bleeding through a stranger's jacket commanded immediate attention. Carter found himself relegated to the waiting room, his clothes stained with her blood, his mind replaying those desperate moments on the rain-soaked road. Hours crawled by like wounded animals. When dawn finally painted the windows gray, a tired nurse emerged with news. The woman had stabilized, but something troubling had happened. She'd awakened briefly, seen the medical staff preparing to examine her injuries, and vanished, simply walked out into the morning mist, leaving behind only a diamond ring that could have bought Carter's truck 10 times over. The ring bore an inscription AW and beneath it an ornate family crest that spoke of old money and older secrets. Carter stared at the sparkling stone in his palm, wondering what kind of woman carried such wealth, yet begged strangers not to touch her. 3 days passed before Carter saw her again. He'd been thinking about her constantly. That brief glimpse of vulnerability and terror, etched into his memory like acid on steel. Morrison had noticed his distraction, gently suggesting that maybe Carter needed to talk to someone about what he'd witnessed. But how could he explain the way her whispered plea had shattered something inside him? How could he describe the weight of holding someone's life in his hands while respecting their fear? The answer came when he stopped by the town library to pick up books for Rose's school project. There in the back corner, where afternoon sunlight painted everything golden, sat the woman from the road. She wore simple jeans and a gray sweater now, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, but there was no mistaking those haunted eyes. She was reading about art therapy, taking careful notes in handwriting that belonged in museums. When she looked up and saw him, her entire body went rigid with recognition and something that might have been shame. "You," she said simply, closing the book with trembling fingers. Carter approached slowly, the way he might approach an injured animal, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I wanted to return this," he said, pulling the diamond ring from his pocket. The afternoon light caught the stone and threw rainbows across the dusty library table. She stared at it as if it were a snake. "How did you know I'd be here?" Her voice carried an accent that spoke of private schools and country clubs, but underneath lay something raw and desperate. "I didn't. I just come here sometimes for my daughter." Carter settled into the chair across from her, noting how she unconsciously adjusted her position to keep her left leg hidden beneath the table. "My name's Carter Wells. I'm glad you're okay." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. "Autumn," she said finally. "Autumn haze, and I'm not sure okay is the right word." The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Their second meeting happened by accident, or perhaps by the strange magnetism that sometimes pulls broken things toward each other. Carter was at Murphy's diner with 7-year-old Rosie, splitting a piece of apple pie that constituted both dessert and a small celebration. Rosie had lost her first tooth that morning, and the tooth fairy's visit had warranted their monthly splurge on eating out. Autumn sat alone in a corner booth, picking at a salad she clearly had no intention of finishing. Rosie spotted her first. "Daddy, that lady looks sad. Like you do sometimes when you think I'm not watching." The observation hit Carter like a physical blow, both for its accuracy and its innocence. Before he could stop her, Rosie had slipped from their booth and approached Autumn's table. "Are you sad because you lost a tooth too?" she asked, displaying her gap-toothed grin with pride. Autumn's transformation was instantaneous. The guarded expression melted away, replaced by genuine warmth as she knelt to Roz's level. "Something like that," she said softly. "But yours is much more exciting than what I lost." When Carter joined them, apologizing for his daughter's boldness, Autumn waved away his concern. She listened with rapt attention as Rosie explained the tooth fairy's exchange rate and her plans for the 2 quarters now burning a hole in her pocket. Something shifted during that impromptu conversation. Autumn's careful composure cracked just enough to reveal glimpses of the person underneath. She knew things about children that suggested experience, spoke about art with the passion of someone who understood creation as healing. When Rosie asked if Autumn knew how to draw, she sketched a perfect butterfly on a napkin, with movements so fluid they seemed like magic. "How did you learn to do that?" Rosie breathed, eyes wide with admiration. "Someone taught me a long time ago," Autumn replied, but her smile faltered slightly before things got complicated. Carter found himself studying her profile, noting the way she held herself like someone perpetually ready to run. There was money in her bearing, education in her vocabulary, but underneath it all lay a fragility that made him want to build walls around her. When they finally parted ways, Autumn pressed the butterfly napkin into Rose's small hands. "For your room," she said. "Butterflies are good luck." As Carter tucked his daughter into bed that night, Rosie taped the napkin carefully to her wall. "I like her, Daddy. She has kind eyes, but they're scared eyes too." 7-year-olds, Carter reflected, saw things adults spent years learning to miss. The third encounter came when Autumn appeared at Morrison's garage on a Thursday afternoon that smelled of motor oil and approaching rain. She drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic that had seen better decades. Its paint faded, and its engine making sounds that would have made lesser mechanics weep. "It's been acting up," she said, popping the hood with the confidence of someone who understood machinery. Carter peered into the engine compartment and found himself impressed. Someone had maintained this car with religious devotion, every component clean and properly adjusted despite its age. "You know cars," he observed, and something in his tone made Autumn's cheeks flush pink. "I had a good teacher," she said quietly, before that word again carrying weight like a stone. As Carter worked, Autumn surprised him by staying close, asking intelligent questions and anticipating his needs with tools. Her hands, though soft with manicured nails, moved with the sureness of someone who'd spent time under hoods. She rolled up her sleeves without hesitation, revealing forearms marked with small scars that looked deliberate. Self-harm, Carter realized with a pang, recognizing the signs from his mandatory first aid training. But when she caught him looking, she didn't flinch or cover them. Instead, she met his gaze steadily. "People deal with pain differently," she said simply. "Some people fix cars, some people fix themselves." Their friendship, if it could be called that, developed in the spaces between words. Autumn began appearing at the garage regularly, sometimes with legitimate car troubles, sometimes just to sit in the corner and sketch while Carter worked. She never got in the way, never demanded attention, but her presence had a strange calming effect on the usually chaotic environment. Morrison, normally suspicious of anyone who didn't smell perpetually of motor oil, took to her immediately. "That girl's got something broken inside," he told Carter one evening as they locked up. "But she's trying to fix it herself. I respect that." Carter found himself looking forward to these visits more than he cared to admit. Autumn had a way of listening that made even mundane stories about stubborn transmissions seem important. She laughed at his dry observations about difficult customers, shared coffee that tasted better than anything he'd had since Linda died, and somehow made the garage feel less like a place of exile and more like a sanctuary. But questions lingered beneath their comfortable routine. Where did she live? How did she afford gas for daily trips to the garage? And why did she sometimes startle at unexpected sounds, her hand unconsciously moving to protect her left thigh? The turning point came on a Friday evening when Carter found Autumn, sitting in her car outside his apartment building, her face streaked with tears and her composure completely shattered. It had been 2 weeks since their first library encounter. 2 weeks of careful friendship, built on shared coffee and automotive troubleshooting. Now she looked like someone fleeing a catastrophe. "I'm sorry," she said when he tapped on her window. "I didn't know where else to go." The admission hung between them like a confession. Carter made a decision that would have horrified the cautious father in him just a month ago. "Come upstairs," he said. "Rose is at her friend's house for a sleepover. We can talk." Autumn's apartment, as it turned out, was a weekly rental at the Milbrook Motel, paid for in cash and furnished with whatever she could fit in a single suitcase. She'd been living this way for over a month, she admitted, ever since fleeing from something she still couldn't bring herself to name. The story came in fragments. Like pieces of broken glass she was afraid to handle too roughly. An engagement to someone her father chose. A wedding planned without her input. A growing realization that her life belonged to everyone except herself. Carter listened without judgment as Autumn described a world he'd only seen in movies. Charity galas where a single dress cost more than his annual salary. Political fundraisers where handshakes determined the fate of legislation. A father whose political ambitions required a daughter who smiled on command and never questioned the cost of power. "I've never made a decision for myself," she said, staring at her hands. "Not what to study, who to date, where to live. Even this," she gestured at the modest apartment around them, "feels like the first real choice I've ever made." Carter found himself wanting to ask about the tattoo he'd glimpsed that first night, about the coordinates that had been etched into her skin. But something in her expression warned him away from that particular truth. Instead, he told her about Linda, about the way grief had hollowed him out and left him rebuilt around the single purpose of being Rosie's father. "Sometimes I think I stopped being Carter the person and became Carter the dad," he admitted. "Until you showed up and reminded me. There might be other versions of myself worth knowing." The confession surprised them both with its honesty. As autumn deepened into winter, their relationship found a rhythm that felt almost normal. Autumn had moved from the motel into a small apartment above the bakery, paying rent by helping with bookkeeping and early morning bread deliveries. She'd become a fixture in Roz's life too, teaching her to paint watercolors and helping with homework that somehow always seemed easier when explained with Autumn's patient voice. Carter found himself thinking in terms of we and us, a linguistic shift that both thrilled and terrified him. Rosie had taken to calling Autumn almost Mom, a designation that made Autumn's eyes shine with tears. She tried to hide. They hadn't defined what they were to each other, hadn't discussed the future beyond next week's dinner plans, but something precious was growing between them, like a garden neither wanted to examine too closely for fear of breaking the spell. It was during one of these peaceful evenings, Rosie asleep, and Autumn curled against Carter's side on the couch, that she spoke the words that would shatter their careful equilibrium. "There's something I need to tell you," she whispered into the lamplight, "about who I really am." The revelation came not through confession, but through catastrophe. Autumn collapsed without warning while helping. Carter diagnosed a particularly stubborn transmission problem, her body seizing as if electricity had coursed through her nervous system. When she came to, her eyes held the unfocused terror of someone trapped between present and past. "Daddy said I have to remember the numbers," she mumbled, her voice taking on the cadence of a frightened child. "The pretty numbers on my leg that no one else can see." Carter's blood turned to ice water. Those weren't random coordinates tattooed on her thigh. They were GPS locations, burned into her skin like a perverted treasure map. As paramedics loaded Autumn onto a stretcher, she grabbed Carter's wrist with surprising strength. "My name," she gasped. "My real name is Autumn Whitmore." The surname hit Carter like a physical blow. Senator James Whitmore, currently leading the polls for the upcoming presidential election. The man whose anti-corruption platform had made him a household name. Autumn Whitmore, his missing daughter, had been front-page news for the past month. Missing, presumed kidnapped, $100,000, reward for information leading to her safe return. Carter's hands shook as he Googled Autumn's name on his phone, dreading what he would find. The images loaded slowly, each pixel revealing a woman he barely recognized. Autumn Whitmore at campaign fundraisers, her smile perfect and empty. Autumn Whitmore at her engagement announcement, standing beside a man whose cold eyes seemed to look through her rather than at her, Robert Ashford III, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune and rising political star in his own right. The couple that would unite two of America's most powerful families, according to the Breathless Society pages. But in every photo, Carter could see what others had missed. The way Autumn's hands never quite relaxed, the slight tension around her eyes that spoke of constant vigilance, the careful positioning that kept her left leg hidden from cameras. She'd been running from more than an unwanted marriage. She'd been running from something that required coordinates tattooed into her skin, like insurance against her own death. Carter thought about Rosie sleeping safely in her bed and felt the first cold fingers of real fear creep up his spine. The black SUVs appeared in Milbrook Falls 3 days later, their tinted windows and government plates turning the quiet town into something from a spy thriller. Carter watched from the garage as serious men in expensive suits questioned the motel clear, the librarian, anyone who might have seen a young woman matching Autumn's description. Morrison pulled him aside with worry, etched deep in his weathered face. "Son, I don't know what kind of trouble that girl's brought to our doorstep, but folks are starting to talk. Maybe it's time to call the authorities." But Carter couldn't shake the memory of Autumn's terrified whisper about the pretty numbers. This wasn't about a runaway daughter. This was about something far more dangerous, something that had driven a senator's daughter to choose homelessness over the safety of her father's house. That night, Carter made a decision that would either save them all or destroy their fragile peace they'd built. He drove to Autumn's apartment and found it empty, cleared out with the efficiency of someone who'd had practice disappearing. A single note waited on the kitchen counter, written in her careful handwriting. "I'm sorry, some secrets are too dangerous to share. Keep Rosie safe." Carter's world narrowed to a single desperate focus, finding Autumn before whoever was hunting her succeeded in their mission. The coordinates tattooed on her thigh had to mean something, but without her to decode them, he was working blind. He spent the next day retracing their time together, looking for clues he might have missed. At the library, the elderly Clark remembered Autumn, returning several books about offshore banking and political corruption, just days before her collapse. "Sweet girl," she said, but always looking over her shoulder like someone was following her. Asked me once if the library kept records of what people checked out. Seemed relieved when I told her we delete that information monthly. The pieces of a larger puzzle began taking shape, one that connected Senator Whitmore's anti-corruption platform with his daughter's desperate flight, and the numbers burned into her skin. Carter realized with growing horror that Autumn hadn't just been running from an unwanted marriage. She'd been running from evidence of her father's hypocrisy, evidence that someone had literally marked her to carry. The truth found Carter before he found Autumn. He returned home from another fruitless day of searching to discover Rosie missing from her after-school program, the babysitter frantic with worry and guilt. A woman came for her. She sobbed, said she was family, had identification. Rosie went with her willingly, kept saying she was happy to see almost mom. Carter's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Your daughter is safe. Meet me at the old lumber mill on Route 12. Come alone." The mill had been abandoned for 20 years, its skeletal frame a monument to Milbrook Falls' more prosperous past. Carter found Autumn there with Rosie, both of them hidden in the mill's office, where broken windows provided multiple escape routes. Rosie ran to him with the uncomplicated joy of a child who trusted that adults would always make things right. But Autumn's face carried the weight of someone who'd run out of places to hide. "They found me," she said simply. "I had maybe an hour before they would have taken me back. I couldn't let them hurt Rosie to get to me." The complete truth spilled out of Autumn like blood from a reopened wound. 3 years of carefully buried secrets finally seeing daylight. The coordinates tattooed on her thigh weren't just locations. They were GPS markers for a dozen offshore accounts, containing evidence of her father's real funding sources, money from pharmaceutical companies seeking favorable legislation, payments from foreign entities wanting influence in American politics, a paper trail that would destroy not just Senator Whitmore's presidential ambitions, but his freedom. "When I turned 16, he had them tattooed on me," Autumn said, her voice eerily calm, said it was insurance. "If anything happened to him, if his enemies got too close, I would be the only way to recover everything." But if I ever betrayed him, if I ever tried to expose what those numbers meant, I would become a target for everyone he'd taken money from. Robert Ashford III hadn't just been her fiancé. He'd been her handler, assigned to marry her and ensure her permanent silence. The engagement party had been the night she'd finally understood the full scope of her father's corruption and her own role as both key and lock in his system of control. Carter listened with growing dread as Autumn described years of psychological conditioning designed to keep her compliant. The drugs slipped into her drinks at political events, the carefully controlled isolation from anyone who might offer genuine support, the subtle threats against people she cared about delivered with her father's political smile. The night I ran, Robert tried to. She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. He said, "Once we were married, I'd learned to be more cooperative. That's when I knew I'd rather die than spend another day in that world." She'd driven aimlessly for hours that night, her father's campaign car running on fumes and adrenaline, until it finally died on the outskirts of Milbrook Falls. The storm, the accident, her desperate plea to Carter not to lift her dress, it had all been motivated by the knowledge that those coordinates represented a death sentence for anyone who knew their significance. "I never meant to drag you into this," she said, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "But when I saw how you were with Rosie, how you could love someone completely without trying to own them, I couldn't help hoping that maybe there was a different way to live." The sound of approaching vehicles cut through Autumn's confession like a blade. Black SUVs surrounded the mill with military precision, their occupants moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who'd done this before. "Stay with Rosie," Autumn told Carter, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. "Whatever happens, protect her. Don't let them use her against me." But Carter had spent 3 years learning that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to refuse to let it be used as a weapon. He pulled out his phone and began recording, capturing Autumn's face as she spoke directly to the camera. "My name is Autumn Elizabeth Whitmore. My father, Senator James Whitmore, has committed crimes that I have evidence of. The coordinates tattooed on my left thigh contain the locations of offshore accounts that detail his corruption. I'm recording this because I may not survive the next few minutes, but the truth should." She rattled off the GPS coordinates from memory, her voice never wavering, even as armed men surrounded their hiding place. Carter sent the recording to every news outlet he could think of, uploading it to social media platforms with tags that would ensure viral spread. The standoff lasted 17 minutes that felt like 17 hours. Robert Ashford III entered the mill flanked by men who carried themselves like private military contractors, their weapons visible beneath expensive suits. He looked exactly like his photographs, handsome in the way of politicians, with eyes that calculated cost-benefit ratios instead of expressing human emotion. "Autumn," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone addressing a wayward pet. "You've caused quite a lot of trouble. It's time to come home." But something had changed in the time since their last encounter. Autumn stood straighter, spoke clearer, met his gaze without flinching. "I am home," she said simply. "This is what home feels like." Robert's smile never wavered, but Carter caught the flash of something ugly beneath its surface. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make anymore. You're coming with us, and your new friends are going to forget this conversation ever happened." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, accurate and inescapable. Carter had exactly one advantage in a situation where he was outgunned, outmanned, and outclassed. He had nothing left to lose except the people he loved, and that made him infinitely more dangerous than men who fought for money or power. "The video's already uploaded," he said, showing Robert his phone screen, where view counts climbed steadily. "Autumn's testimony, the coordinates, everything. You can kill us, but you can't kill the internet." For the first time, Robert's composure cracked slightly. Political scandals could be managed. Witnesses could be discredited, but viral videos had a life of their own. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice losing its calculated warmth. "The people those accounts implicate don't forgive mistakes. You've signed all of your death warrants." But Autumn stepped forward, placing herself between Robert and Carter's family with the quiet courage of someone who'd finally stopped running. "Maybe," she said, "but at least now everyone will know why we died. That's more than you were going to give us." The FBI arrived exactly 23 minutes after. Carter's video hit 10,000 views, their timing suggesting they'd been monitoring the situation longer than anyone had realized. Special Agent Sarah Chen took control of the scene, with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to cleaning up political messes, but her eyes held genuine concern as she assessed Autumn's condition. "Miss Whitmore," she said formally, "we've been looking for you for quite some time. Are you prepared to make an official statement regarding the allegations in your video?" What followed was 3 hours of the most surreal testimony Carter had ever witnessed. Autumn recited coordinates, account numbers, and dates with the precision of someone who'd been forced to memorize them perfectly. Each piece of information she provided unlocked another layer of corruption, revealing a network of illegal campaign contributions and foreign influence that reached far beyond her father's Senate seat. Robert Ashford III and his security team found themselves detained as material witnesses, their weapons confiscated and their phones seized as evidence. Carter watched it all unfold with the detached fascination of someone observing a car accident in slow motion. The media descended on Milbrook Falls like locusts, transforming the quiet town into a three-ring circus of satellite trucks and ambitious reporters. Carter's garage became an unofficial headquarters for journalists, seeking the human interest angle of the story, much to Morrison's grumbling annoyance. But through it all, Autumn remained remarkably composed, giving measured statements to federal investigators, while somehow managing to shield Rosie from the worst of the chaos. She'd arranged for protective custody for Carter and his daughter, recognizing that their association with her had made them targets for anyone seeking to contain the scandal. "I won't let my choices destroy your life," she told Carter during one of their brief supervised visits. "You saved me, but that doesn't mean you're responsible for the consequences." The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd lifted her dress to save her life, and in doing so, had revealed secrets that might destroy them both. The trial, when it finally began, revealed the full scope of Senator Whitmore's crimes and the psychological torture he'd inflicted on his own daughter. Autumn testified for 4 days, her voice never breaking, even as she described years of systematic abuse disguised as political training. The coordinates tattooed on her thigh became Exhibit A, a permanent reminder of how her father had turned her body into a vault for his secrets. Other victims came forward. Staffers who'd been silenced, witnesses who'd been threatened, journalists who'd been discredited for getting too close to the truth. The case became a watershed moment for political accountability. But for Carter, watching from the gallery, it was simply the slow process of watching someone he loved reclaim her right to exist. When the verdicts were finally read, guilty on all counts for Senator Whitmore, multiple felony convictions for Robert Ashford III, Carter felt not triumph but exhaustion. Justice had been served, but at a cost that couldn't be calculated in prison sentences. 6 months after the trial ended, Carter found himself packing boxes in a house he had never expected to own. The Witness Protection Program had relocated them to a cabin in rural Montana, far from the media attention and potential retribution that still shadowed their lives. The irony of their situation wasn't lost on him. Autumn had traded a mansion for a 2-bedroom cabin, while he'd traded an apartment for more space than he'd ever thought possible. Rosie adapted with the resilience of childhood. Excited by the prospect of having her own room and a yard big enough for a tire swing, Autumn moved through their new life with quiet grace, teaching art classes at the local community center and helping Carter establish a small auto repair business in their converted garage. They'd never formally discussed their relationship status, never made grand declarations or exchanged rings, but something deeper than romance had grown between them. During the long months of testimony and trial, their new normal settled around them like snow, quiet and transformative. Carter woke each morning to the sound of Autumn making coffee in their small kitchen, her presence as essential as breathing. Rosie started 3rd grade at a school where no one knew. Her father had once been photographed with senators and criminals, where she was simply another kid who liked to draw horses and collected interesting rocks. Autumn's nightmares gradually faded, replaced by dreams she actually wanted to remember. The tattoo on her thigh remained, but she'd found a local artist, willing to transform those sinister coordinates into something beautiful. A delicate pattern of wildflowers that bloomed over the numbers without quite hiding them. "I want to remember," she explained to Carter one evening as they sat on their porch, watching Rosie chase fireflies. "Not the pain, but the fact that I survived it." The distinction mattered more than anyone who hadn't lived through systematic abuse could understand. The reporters stopped calling after the first year, their attention shifting to newer scandals and fresher outrages. Carter's video had sparked dozens of investigations and reform initiatives, but the initial frenzy of attention had burned itself out like a wildfire. Occasionally, law enforcement officials would contact them with follow-up questions or requests for additional testimony, but even those interruptions became less frequent as the legal machinery ground toward its inevitable conclusions. Carter found himself grateful for the return to anonymity, for the luxury of worrying about ordinary things like Rose's math homework and whether their truck would pass its next inspection. Autumn threw herself into her art, therapy work with the passion of someone who'd finally found her calling, helping other survivors of abuse discover their voices through color and canvas.
Healing isn't about forgetting.
She told her students, it's about choosing who gets to write your story going forward. On a Tuesday evening in late autumn, exactly 2 years after that rain-soaked night that had changed everything, Carter found Autumn sitting on their front porch with a cup of tea and a faraway look in her eyes. Rosie was at a friend's house for a sleepover, leaving them with the rare luxury of uninterrupted conversation. The air carried the crisp promise of winter, and somewhere in the distance an owl called to its mate with patient persistence. Do you ever regret it? Autumn asked without preamble, her voice barely audible above the evening chorus of crickets. Carter knew she wasn't asking about their relationship or their move to Montana. She was asking about that split-second decision to lift her dress. Despite her terrified plea, the choice that had saved her life but set in motion everything that followed. He considered the question seriously, thinking about everything they'd lost and gained in the intervening months. I regret that you had to go through any of it, he said finally. But I don't regret saving you. I can't. Autumn nodded as if his answer confirmed something she'd already known. I used to think courage meant never being afraid, she said, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. But you taught me it actually means being terrified and choosing to act anyway. They sat in comfortable silence for a long while, two people who'd learned that some conversations didn't require words. Carter reached for her hand, noting how the calluses she'd developed from working in their garden had softened the manicured perfection she'd once maintained. Everything about their life was smaller now, their house, their bank account, their circle of friends, but it felt infinitely more real than anything either of them had known before. When Autumn finally spoke again, her voice carried a contentment that would have been impossible to fake. I'm happy, she said simply. For the first time in my life, I'm actually happy. Carter squeezed her hand gently, understanding that happiness for people like them wasn't a destination, but a daily choice. The conversation turned to practical matters. Ross's upcoming school play, their plans for Thanksgiving, whether they should adopt the stray cat that had been hanging around their garbage cans. Ordinary concerns that felt extraordinary after everything they'd survived. As the night grew colder, they moved inside to their small living room, where a fire crackled in the stone fireplace Carter had rebuilt by hand. Autumn curled up beside him on the second-hand couch they'd found at a local thrift store, her head resting on his shoulder, with the trust of someone who'd finally learned to feel safe. What do you think happens next? She asked, her voice drowsy with contentment. Carter considered the question, thinking about the future they were building one careful day at a time. More of this, he said quietly. Just more of this. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture or a promise of eternal bliss. It was something better, the commitment to keep choosing each other, one morning at a time for as long as they both drew breath. Outside their windows, Montana spread beneath, the sky so clear and dark that individual stars stood out like pinpricks in black velvet. Inside, 3 people who'd found each other in the aftermath of tragedy had created something precious. A home built not on shared history but on shared hope. Carter listened to Autumn's breathing slow as she drifted toward sleep and felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd finally learned the difference between existing and living. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Roz's questions about her changing family, Autumn's ongoing therapy sessions, the eternal struggle of making ends meet on a mechanic's salary. But tonight, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Some stories don't end with grand gestures or definitive conclusions.